The security guard at the military base gate laughed when the old man showed his faded military ID. This expired 40 years ago, Grandpa. He had no idea he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. The morning sun beat down on Edwards Air Force Base as 82-year-old William Bill Crawford approached the main gate. He wore a simple blue button-down shirt, khaki pants, and carried a worn leather briefcase. His movements were slow but purposeful, the walk of a man who had covered serious ground in his lifetime. Staff Sergeant Kevin Torres, 24 years old and fresh out of security training, barely looked up from his phone when the old man approached the checkpoint. This was going to be another boring shift of checking IDs and waving through authorized personnel. But what happened in the next 30 minutes would change everything. "Morning, sir. ID, please," Torres said without looking up, his tone already dismissive. Bill reached into his wallet and pulled out a military identification card. The plastic was yellowed with age, the photo showing a young Air Force officer from decades past. Torres glanced at it and immediately started laughing. "Are you serious right now? This thing expired in 1983. What do you think this is, a museum?" Other guards at the checkpoint turned to see what was funny. Soon, 3 young airmen were chuckling at the elderly man with the ancient ID. "Sir, you need to leave the premises immediately," Torres continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is a restricted military installation, not a tourist attraction." Bill looked at the young sergeant calmly. "Son, I understand the ID is old, but if you could just call your commanding officer and tell them that Colonel William Crawford is here for the ceremony, I think you'll find—" "Colonel?" Torres interrupted, laughing even harder. "Right, and I'm a general. Listen, old-timer, I don't know what ceremony you think is happening, but no one told us about any special visitors today." But what Torres didn't know would shock him beyond belief. Bill had indeed been a colonel. Not just any colonel, but the youngest pilot to ever fly experimental aircraft at Edwards Air Force Base. In 1968, at age 26, he had become the first pilot to break Mach 3 in the prototype that would become the SR-71 Blackbird. More importantly, he had saved the entire test program when a catastrophic engine failure during his record-breaking flight nearly killed him and destroyed years of research. His quick thinking and piloting skills had not only saved his life, but preserved the aircraft that would become America's most advanced spy plane. The ceremony Torres claimed to know nothing about was actually the dedication of the new SR-71 memorial exhibit, and Colonel William Crawford was the guest of honor. "Look, Grandpa," Torres said, his patience wearing thin. "I'm going to ask you one more time to leave, or I'm going to have to call base security to escort you out." "That won't be necessary," Bill replied quietly. "But you might want to call your commanding officer anyway." Something in the old man's voice made Torres pause for a moment, but his arrogance quickly returned. "You know what? Fine. Let me call this in so they can explain to you why your little field trip is over." Torres picked up his radio, but what he didn't know was that his call was about to trigger a chain of events that would reach the highest levels of the military. As Torres prepared to make the call, a young airman named Jessica Martinez had been quietly observing the entire exchange from the adjacent checkpoint. Something about the elderly man's bearing, the way he stood despite the humiliation, reminded her of her grandfather, who had served in Vietnam. More importantly, she had actually read the base bulletin that morning, something Torres had obviously skipped. There was indeed a ceremony scheduled, and the name William Crawford had been prominently featured. Martinez quickly pulled out her phone and Googled William Crawford Edwards Air Force Base. What she found made her blood run cold. The first result was a Military Times article. SR-71 test pilot William Crawford to be honored at Edwards AFB Memorial Dedication. The second result was even more shocking. President to attend SR-71 Memorial Ceremony, honor legendary test pilot. The President of the United States was coming to Edwards Air Force Base today to honor the man Torres was about to have arrested. Martinez looked up at Torres, who was still laughing with his buddies, completely oblivious to the catastrophe he was about to unleash. She had two choices: stay quiet and watch Torres destroy his career, or speak up and potentially save him from the biggest mistake of his life. But before she could decide, the sound that would change everything began echoing across the desert. The unmistakable roar of fighter jets in formation. Torres looked up, confused. What's that about? We weren't notified of any air traffic today. Bill Crawford looked up at the approaching aircraft and smiled for the first time since arriving at the gate. "Son," he said quietly, "you might want to make that phone call now." Torres finally grabbed his radio, but not to report an intruder. Something in the old man's calm confidence was beginning to penetrate his arrogance. "Base operations. This is Gate 1. We have an elderly gentleman here claiming to be Colonel William Crawford. Says he's here for some kind of ceremony. Can you verify?" The response that came through the radio made Torres drop his coffee cup. "Gate 1. Did you say Colonel William Crawford? Where is he? Is he safe? Do not, I repeat, do not detain that man." The voice on the radio belonged to Base Commander General Patricia Hayes, and she sounded more panicked than Torres had ever heard a general sound. Yes, ma'am. He's right here at the checkpoint. We were about to..." "Sergeant Torres, you will escort Colonel Crawford to the VIP lounge immediately. The President's advance team has been looking for him for the past hour." Torres felt his stomach drop to somewhere around his ankles, but the real shock was still coming. Within minutes, the fighter jet formation became visible on the horizon. Behind them, growing larger by the second, was the distinctive blue and white aircraft that every American recognized. Air Force One. Torres watched in horror as the President's plane approached Edwards Air Force Base for an unscheduled landing. The ceremony he had claimed didn't exist was apparently important enough to bring the Commander-in-Chief to the middle of the California desert. Airman Martinez approached Torres, who looked like he was about to be sick. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "I tried to warn you. Colonel Crawford isn't just any veteran. He's one of the most important test pilots in Air Force history, and today, the President is here to give him the Congressional Gold Medal." Torres turned to look at Bill Crawford, who was standing patiently by the gate, still holding his worn briefcase. The old man's expression showed no anger, no satisfaction at Torres's obvious distress, just the quiet dignity of someone who had been underestimated before and would be again. "Colonel Crawford," Torres stammered, I apologize, sir. I had no idea." Bill looked at the young sergeant with understanding eyes. "Son, you couldn't have known. But perhaps next time, you might consider that not everyone's service looks the way you expect it to." The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their conversation. A convoy of black SUVs was racing across the tarmac toward their position. But what happened next surprised everyone. Instead of military police coming to arrest Torres for the security breach, the lead vehicle contained General Hayes herself, followed by what appeared to be the President's entire advance team. General Hayes jumped out of the vehicle before it had fully stopped. "Colonel Crawford?" she called out, ignoring Torres completely. "Sir, we've been looking everywhere for you. The President has been asking about your arrival." She turned to Torres with an expression that could have melted steel. "Sergeant Torres, report to my office immediately after this ceremony. We need to discuss your understanding of protocol." Torres felt his military career flashing before his eyes, but Colonel Crawford interrupted. "General Hayes, Sergeant Torres was doing his job. Perhaps the breakdown was in communication, not execution." It was an act of grace that Torres would never forget. Air Force One touched down on the runway as the group watched from the gate. Within minutes, the President of the United States would be meeting with the man Torres had tried to have removed from the base. As they waited for the presidential motorcade, General Hayes briefed Colonel Crawford on the ceremony details. "Sir, this is long overdue. Your contributions to the SR-71 program remained classified for decades. Most Americans have never heard your name, but your courage and skill gave this country its most important intelligence-gathering capability." Torres listened in growing amazement as he learned more about the man he had so casually dismissed. Colonel Crawford had flown 89 test flights in experimental aircraft. He had survived 7 emergency landings. His innovations in high-altitude flight had contributed to every stealth aircraft program that followed. More importantly, on that fateful day in 1968 when his SR-71 prototype suffered catastrophic failure at Mach 3, his decision to stay with the aircraft instead of ejecting had saved not just the plane, but years of research and development. The data from that near-fatal flight had been crucial to perfecting the SR-71's design. "Colonel," General Hayes continued, "the President specifically requested this ceremony because he believes the American people should know about heroes like you. Classified or not, your service deserves recognition." The presidential motorcade was now visible, approaching the gate where this entire drama had unfolded. Torres stood at rigid attention, sweating despite the California desert heat. He was about to meet the President of the United States and explain why he had almost prevented a congressional gold medal ceremony from happening. But Colonel Crawford had one more surprise in store. As the President's limousine pulled up, Colonel Crawford turned to Torres. "Sergeant, would you like to meet the President?" Torres couldn't believe what he was hearing. After the way he had treated the Colonel, he was being offered the opportunity of a lifetime. "Sir, I don't deserve that after how I acted." "Son," Colonel Crawford said with a gentle smile, "we all make mistakes. What matters is how we learn from them." The President stepped out of the limousine and immediately approached Colonel Crawford with obvious respect and admiration. "Colonel Crawford, it's an honor to finally meet you. Your country owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid." As photos were taken and formalities exchanged, Torres stood to the side, watching a masterclass in grace and dignity from a man who had every right to be angry with him. The ceremony that followed was attended by hundreds of Air Force personnel, aerospace engineers, and VIPs from around the country. Colonel Crawford's speech was brief but powerful. "I never flew those test flights for recognition," he said from the podium. "I flew them because that's what the mission required. Every person who serves, whether in the cockpit or at the gate, is part of something bigger than themselves." His eyes found Torres in the crowd for that last line. After the ceremony, as the presidential entourage prepared to depart, Colonel Crawford approached Torres one final time. "Sergeant, I have something for you." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small box. Inside was a set of SR-71 cufflinks, the kind given only to those who had actually flown the aircraft. These belonged to my co-pilot on that last test flight. He didn't make it home from Vietnam, but he always said the real heroes were the people who kept us safe on the ground. Torres accepted the gift with tears in his eyes. "Sir, I don't know what to say. Just remember that everyone has a story, son. Sometimes the most important ones are carried quietly." As Air Force One prepared for departure, General Hayes approached Torres. "Sergeant, I've been thinking about our earlier conversation. Colonel Crawford made a good point about communication failures." Torres prepared for the worst. "Instead of disciplinary action, you're going to help us develop new protocols for VIP recognition. We can't have this happen again." It was an assignment that would change Torres's career trajectory and make him an expert in military protocol and veteran recognition. Years later, Torres would become the base's leading expert on military history and VIP procedures. He would tell the story of Colonel Crawford to every new security trainee, always ending with the same lesson. Never judge a book by its cover. Never assume someone's importance by their appearance. And never, ever underestimate the quiet dignity of those who served before you. The SR-71 Memorial at Edwards Air Force Base now includes a plaque dedicated to Colonel William Crawford. But more importantly, it includes a smaller plaque near the visitor's entrance. In honor of all who serve with quiet dignity, and in memory of the lessons learned when we almost missed recognizing a hero. Colonel Crawford continued to visit the base regularly until his passing 5 years later. He always used the same gate where he had first encountered Sergeant Torres. And every time, Torres was there to greet him personally, treating him with the respect and honor he deserved from the very beginning. Sometimes the most important lessons come from our biggest mistakes. And sometimes, grace in the face of disrespect teaches us more about character than any training manual ever could. The story of the day Air Force One landed at Edwards spread throughout the military as a reminder that heroes don't always look like what we expect them to look like. And sometimes they're standing right in front of us, waiting patiently to be recognized.